Right. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So many of you know me, but for those who don't, my name is Sean Hindley. I'm a board member for the Parkinson's Association of West Michigan. And for my day job, I work in regulatory affairs. And to put it in simple terms, the regulatory affairs group is the group that puts the applications together that the FDA reviews. And my specialty in that is not the clinical side, because I don't have any medical training, but what my specialty is in how the drug is manufactured and how the drug is tested. And that is an important part of the application process, along with all the clinical data and the non-clinical data. So the information that I'm going to be presenting this morning is applicable for the US, but is also very similar to what will be done in Canada, England, the EU, and other jurisdictions around the world. And we're first going to talk about the FDA. So the FDA was established in around 1906. It has a long history. The regulations are always evolving, and they do that to keep pace with changes in medical science. Many of the regulations today that the FDA has, they were created in response to previous health crises around the world and in the US. And the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for protecting the public health by assuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinarian drugs, along with biological drugs, medical devices, the nation's food supply, cosmetics, and even products that emit radiation, such as a microwave. So our first thing here is that patients really need safe and effective drugs. So understanding a drug's safety and safety profile is one step in creating safe and effective drugs. Safety is the measurement of adverse events. For example, usage of a drug that may cause dry mouth or sleepiness. And then they also look at the risk for the drug. So does the risk to the drug outweigh the benefits of the drugs? This helps to determine the safety profile of that particular drug. And a good example is the two recent approvals for Alzheimer's drugs. One of the side effects from those two drugs is brain swelling, and that's a pretty significant side effect. However, there isn't any drugs that really treat Alzheimer's disease to slow it down. And so the agency decided to approve those two drugs, even though brain swelling is a pretty significant side effect. It's also very similar to cancer drugs. Cancer drugs are extremely toxic. But again, the recourse is the patient doesn't survive. And so that's another reason why the FDA in some cases does approve drugs that do have some significant side effects. And then effectiveness is, does the drug product treat the intended condition in the majority of patients in comparison to placebo? So here's our drug development. Simplified, we've got drug discovery, preclinical research, clinical development, FDA review, which is also the part where they assemble the application, post-market monitoring, which can also be post-approval monitoring. So bringing a drug to market can take about 5 to 20 years, depending on the drug type. A generic drug is usually the quickest drug to bring to market. Let's look at this slide again with a little bit more detail. So we've got drug discovery, 5 to 6 years. Phase 1 is usually less than a year. Phase 2 is 1 to 2 years. Phase 3 can be 1 to 4 years. So right there, you're already looking at over 10 years. And that's if your clinical trials are all in a row and they're all successful each time. So drug discovery is the first stage. And when developing a new drug for PD, knowledge of how PD develops allows the researchers to design a drug that stops or reverses the effects of the disease. So we can see here we have knowledge of the drug, PD is the accumulation of alpha-synuclein, and this allows for a drug company to pick a drug target because what they're trying to do is prevent the accumulation of alpha-synuclein. About 5,000 to 20,000 compounds are screened in the drug development process. So we're talking a lot of work, and only 250 go on to the preclinical stage. So the preclinical stage is the stage where we look at the drug in animals. Different types of animal studies include pharmacokinetic studies, which is how the organism interacts with the drug. Pharmacodynamic studies, the action of the drug on the organism. And toxicology studies, how the drug causes undesirable effects on the organism. And from this stage, we start with 250 and only 5 go into clinical stage. So here's a pictorial of the different types of clinical phases. So we're starting at preclinical laboratory studies, which we just talked about. And then there are 4 phases of clinical. Phase 4 is always done after approval, but the other 3 phases are all done before approval. And as the drug progresses from phase 1 through phase 4, the subject population exposed to the drug product increases. So phase 1 is less than 100 patients. Phase 2 is 50 to 500. Phase 3 can be several thousand. And phase 4 is also several thousand, but again, done after approval. So you can see here from clinical phase 1, this is usually first time testing in humans and is usually done in volunteers. Trials are often very small, about 50 people. And the primary aim here is the medicine safe? Can it reach the part of the body it needs to? Can it act at that part of the body? And a drug can't move to phase 2 unless the primary aim is met. For phase 2 trials, it is involving a larger number of volunteers that have the illness with the primary aim of what is the medicine's biological effect? Does it perform as expected? It measures both effectiveness and safety. If the phase 2 trials meet their endpoint, the drug can move to phase 3. When a phase 2 trial is not successful, a drug company can change the target endpoint and run another phase 2 trial. Because the endpoint is really the critical part of your trial. So if your endpoint is a lower URPDS score, and that doesn't meet the endpoint, the drug company might pick a different endpoint to see if the drug is still working. So phase 3 are larger studies, and these studies are usually done in many different countries and run at several different sites. Again, the primary aim is demonstrating effectiveness. It tests the long-term safety. The larger study identifies possible side effects that might affect a particular group of patients. And for types, we've got placebo-controlled study and a comparative study, which compares new treatment with the current best treatment. So for placebo-controlled and blinded studies, which there's sometimes a little bit confusion on what they are. So a placebo trial is some patients will receive placebo instead of the drug. And a blinded trial or study means that the drug or placebo given to the patient is hidden. So they don't know if they're taking the placebo or if they have the active drug. A double-blinded placebo-controlled clinical trial, which is one of the most common types. Double-blinded study means that both the patient and the clinical staff are unaware of which patient receives what treatment. And this is very important so that there's no bias, because if the doctor knows the patient is getting the active drug, they might measure the patient differently. And so by cutting out the bias, you do that by having a blinded study. And completion of double-blinded studies is really necessary to receive approval by regulators in both the US, the EU, and in Britain. And so we've got 5 compounds will enter the clinical phase and only 1 will be successful. Many fail at phase 1, others at phase 2, and some at phase 3. So the new drug application, once all of that information is put together, an applicant or a pharmaceutical company assembles a new drug application. The information in the application covers preclinical and clinical data and how the drug is manufactured and tested. The FDA has 1 year to review this information when they receive the application, and they can decide to approve the drug or not approve the drug. If the FDA does not approve the drug product, the applicant can resubmit the application with new data. So why might the FDA deny a product? There's insufficient clinical data. Side effects outweigh the drug's benefit. And drug manufacturing and testing information is insufficient in the application. And in most jurisdictions around the world, companies do pay for their applications to be reviewed. And in the US, it's over $3 million. And on top of that, they pay $500,000 each year for each drug. So is there an easier approach? So generic drugs is one option. I spent most of my career in the generic drug industry. Generally speaking, a brand name, example Sinemet, is allowed a 20-year patent upon discovery of the drug. FDA also allows for at least 7 years of marketing of that drug without any competition. Once the patent has expired, a generic drug, which is an exact copy of the existing drug, can enter the market. Costs are significantly lower for generic drugs since the applicant relies on the preclinical and clinical data already submitted to the FDA by the brand. A generic drug is tested against the brand name drug in a bioequivalency study, and these applications are reviewed by the FDA and approved by the FDA. A generic drug can usually take about 5 to 10 years to develop, and the result is the patient can receive the drug sooner and is less expensive. The cost of a generic drug is governed by principles of supply and demand. If numerous manufacturers are manufacturing the generic, then the price will be much lower. Drug repurposing is also another option. Repurposing and repositioning of a drug is a process of taking an already approved drug and placing the drug in a clinical trial for another related or unrelated disease. For example, the clinical trial of isradipine, which is a blood pressure medicine, in Parkinson's patients. Since the drug had already been approved and the safety profile well known, a Parkinson's trial could start at clinical phase 2, bypassing preclinical and clinical phase 1 stages of drug development. This reduces clinical costs since the drug is already commercially produced and simplifies the new drug application. And some examples here. So the international linked clinical trials is an international consortium that identifies potential new therapies for PD from drugs approved to treat other conditions and have demonstrated neuroprotective effects in preclinical experiments. So here are some examples. Ambroxol, which is a drug approved in Europe for respiratory diseases. It never came to the US, so it's not approved here. but they're trying that as it did have some effect. And a phase 3 trial is starting sometime early next year or later this year. Azenatide, which is another product, it's approved for diabetes. It's in phase 3 trial. Nortriptyline is one as well, and then isradipine. That study has already been completed, and the primary endpoint is not met. And that's all I have. I know this was a little dry, but putting together an application can be a little dry. So, yes.
Probably not pertinent to our discussion, but why do the COVID vaccines take 2 years?
Why did they take 2 years to get approval? 2 years to
The COVID vaccines.
Okay, so that the COVID vaccine was based on brand new technology. It wasn't the technology of older vaccines. And so because it was new technology, with new vaccines, they had to take a longer time to make sure that the vaccine was safe.
Didn't take 10 years.
No, it didn't take them 10 years. It only took them 2 years because they were working around the clock to get it done because there was a significant healthcare need to get that product approved.
And that's such an important question. It's a really, really vital discussion. I think what our experience of that was that the COVID vaccines, everybody was working exactly around the clock, and regulators were receiving the data pretty much in real time, so that they were looking at the data as studies were coming through, and that meant they were able to assess safety of different vaccines that were in development, which is why they managed to approve them so quickly. The other really big difference with COVID is that certainly with the treatments that they were developing, they were aiming to stop hospitalization. Now, I haven't had COVID, so I can't really talk from experience on this one. But normally people are sick and then they get really sick, and that's when they end up in hospital. But that's quite a short time frame. It's a couple of weeks. With Parkinson's, the change is actually quite slow. It's not slow to you, but in terms of being able to measure that change, it's quite difficult to pick up that subtlety of change in an individual, particularly if you're relying on the clinical tests. So Parkinson's trials are very difficult because they're long, they involve a lot of people, and they're still relying on the wretched UPDRS as the outcome. Sorry, I am very off the UPDRS, and I'm really hopeful that we will very shortly be able to use things like digital measures which will pick up the subtle change that happens to people in time, because that will hopefully make our trials shorter, but also more relevant, and also actually we'll get answers more quickly. So it's to do with comparing very different diseases as to how quickly you can move things forward. But your point about the regulation is really important. This was a global health crisis and all regulators had to put their attention on it. Absolutely. And talking to the regulatory team at the MHRA, who we know had a lot of interaction with at that time, they absolutely said they were getting data in day and night, and they had a team who were sort of almost like a plat, crossing over, evaluating the data so that they could approve as quickly as they could.
Yes.
Sean, we just came in, so we might have missed, maybe you talked about it, but so is it a problem getting people to participate in these trials? Is that, or is that not a hiccup?
No, it really is a big problem getting patients to participate in clinical trials. And I'm not sure what the barriers are, but it is a big problem in the US. Like, I don't know what the stats are, but maybe 25% or more of clinical trials are not getting the patients that they need to be able to do the trial. Yes.
To that question, one kind of simple problem is if those of us say that live here in Grand Rapids want to participate in a trial, we can go to clinicaltrials.gov or wherever and find a trial that we think looks interesting, we want to participate in. And then you get to look and, okay, we don't have a research institute, a clinical research institute here in GR, so can't do it here. Michigan State may not have that. U of M may. Quest Research over in Farmington Hills probably does. I mean, that's what they do as a business, is run trials, but that's a 2.5-hour drive once or twice a month for a year that you're committing to. And that's a pretty big commit. I mean, they might pay for your gas and that's it. And you're gonna go probably get another DAT scan, get blood drawn every week, hopefully, or every month. And so some of it is just logistics. You know, if I lived in Ann Arbor or Detroit or Chicago, they have Northwestern, I'd probably participate in more.
I think Martin quite wants to comment on this.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of an extension of what you were saying, Dan, and what we were discussing yesterday at the end of the afternoon with our own group, that for many people, they want to participate in a clinical trial, but it's also very frustrating because you have, you know, what are these inclusion and exclusion criteria, and the list is long. And many people, you know, it's all minute stuff. And if you have this little symptom, okay, you're out. You know, if you have that, you know, you're out. And then things change, you're about to start, and then your doctor prescribes, you know, a new medication, and boom, you're out, right? So I think there is definitely the willingness to participate, but it's also hard to participate. And in part that is driven because we're looking at symptoms. And maybe if we start looking at biology, you know, it might be a little bit easier to start enrolling in these trials because we're looking at a new concept that, you know, it's not symptom dependent necessarily. We want to change alpha-synuclein independent of the symptoms. So that is one point. Another point, being a University of Michigan former academic, you're right. So it is where you're at, right? There are many clinical trials going on in Ann Arbor. And when I did my research, it was a whole lot easier because we had very specialized movement disorder clinics for the doctors. That there's 10 movement disorder specialists in Ann Arbor. And they're still booked solid. Takes you a half year to get your first appointment there.
East Lansing does, Michigan State has.
Right, but again, you're near the
Yeah.
large centers where things happening, right? Or in Detroit, Peter DeWitt. I mean, he's another big name, you know, in clinical trials. That makes it a whole lot easier than you know, don't take it as an insult, but when you would live on the Upper Peninsula where that isn't, right? So.
And some
So
people,
there's different. I think there's the willingness. I think I always see great willingness from everybody to participate in clinical trials. There's just many obstacles to it, not put in place deliberately, but they're just there.
as you get older, it's harder to make those commutes and stuff like that. And
Oh, and one very pragmatic one
Right.
that we encountered a lot is many people with Parkinson's are dependent on a caretaker to take them to the clinical trial site. And that might be hard because they have a daytime job or they have other things, you know, and so you need to build in that time. So that's, for example, why decentralized clinical trials are becoming more popular. So what Helen was talking about, can we do a lot of these measurements at home using digital technologies and using maybe video or little tasks that you got to do on your phone that are very meaningful, that tell you a little bit about the effect of your medication as well, but don't place that high burden on you, the participant, to, you know, once a month travel to, you know, some clinical site. Still might have to travel occasionally, but perhaps not as much.
So those of you who were with us last year might remember a presentation that Camille Carroll gave about a programme that's getting underway in the UK, which is called a multi-arm, multi-stage clinical trial. So you have a number of drugs you're going to test in parallel. They are starting at phase 2. They have to go over a very little jump to move into phase 3. So it's not a big, complicated thing, but you can do lots of biochemistry as you go. So you just keep the whole thing running. So you don't have to do the stop, start of a clinical trial, which is when you lose time. And looking at Sean's brilliant chart, you can see how there are plenty of opportunities for time frames to slip. So it's about adding time efficiency, but also cost efficiency, because there's one placebo group that you're working with. The thing that I've got very excited about with this project is that we're going to be trying to recruit 1,600 people with Parkinson's into this one study, which is a lot. We're going to have 3 drugs, 1 placebo group, and we're going to be using an outcome in the trial that can be delivered remotely, so that people don't have to go into hospital. There will probably be 3 points that you might need to travel into a centre, which during a trial duration of what could be 3 to 4 years actually is not bad. You know, that would be for your recruitment, but it would also be for your final endpoint, and maybe an occasional blood test or a scan or something if there was a sub-study you chose to get involved in, with the view of trying to make this low burden for people to participate, to make it as broad as possible for people to participate. And we're also really working, because this is not the drugs are all generic drugs we're going to be using in the first rounds, but it's about trying to make sure that we're involving people who've been living with Parkinson's for a while. You know, it's not for the very newly diagnosed, which so many commercial trials are. So I think that this is the future that we'll be looking at, and there will be more of these types of studies getting underway. We know there's interest in France, for example, to build a similar platform, and also in Norway to do a similar platform. So I think these opportunities will be coming. But I absolutely hear you. It's finding the opportunity, it's making it accessible, and you know, too often we hear, I'm too old, I'm too young, I've had Parkinson's for too long, you know, or I haven't had Parkinson's long enough. And that willingness to participate, you know, if somebody's brave enough to put up their hand to volunteer, we want to make sure that we can create an opportunity for them.
I think that sometimes I felt maybe underappreciated once you were in it, not by the technician or the doctor that was dealing with it, but by the study overall.
Yeah.
Because if you put in a year or 2 to it and then the drug doesn't go any farther, I think there should just be, I think we're a partner at that point in time.
Absolutely.
They wanted you to think you were a partner until then they're done with you. And I think that it's I think they dropped the ball on that, and people get disgusted, less likely to do it again.
Absolutely.
I
So
second that
Yeah.
very strongly. I had a big discussion with the clinic, not the staff, you say, I mean, we're great, but they didn't view me as a collaborator, they didn't keep me informed, they didn't communicate, they didn't even say thank you. When I was on my last day, it was like, so this is my last meeting, isn't it? Yep.
Surely it's.
You know, and just a low hanging fruit
Yeah.
of just saying,
Yeah.
you know, without people, I could have scripted it for them, you know.
But also, Dan, people who've been part of the study are the best ambassadors to involve other people in studies. And so that you know, that positive, you know, handing on the baton is so important. So these are all lessons we've got to get smarter at. Anyway.
One more, just
Yeah.
real quick. I don't think it's not really a drug study, but it's a way to participate in research is that, and it's something all of us in this room can do is, I think the PPMI study, right? On the Fox Foundation website, all you have to do is sign up. They'll start sending you quarterly surveys that take about 20 minutes on your web browser to fill out. And I think it's that kind of data, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that helped with this recent discovery of the biomarker, wasn't it?
It does. And I think also there's Fox Insight, which is a surveying platform, which is brilliant. But there are also things like genetic studies that people can get involved in, as well as more broad other survey studies.
Well, right at Spectrum, well, Corewell, you can do the All of Us research study, which they're trying to enroll 1 million people throughout the country. But again, just gathering DNA from enough people, to, you know, kind of serendipitously come across you know, hey, you know, because we have so many people, we might find something that otherwise we wouldn't have found because it's
Exactly.
too rare.
Exactly.
And do places like that share, because I'm part of All of Us, but I'm also part of Cancer where I'm spitting and pooping in a bag and sending it in. Are they sharing it with any? I mean,
The All of Us is,
So I hope that, you know, certainly I know that PD Generation have got broad data sharing because they're sharing their data into the GP2 global genetics program. And I think the more that data sharing that people, you know, who are involved in studies demand data sharing, the more likely we're going to get broad data sharing. And then that means that data sets can be shared with Martin, and then it means that we've got these wonderful data sets to data mine.